Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thanks to the Cambridge Forum, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to start by talking about the genesis of this book, how it developed. I was asked in the 70s, when I was a junior faculty member at the American University of Beirut, whether I would consider doing some work on Soviet Middle East policy. And I told the people who asked me to do this, I don't know any Russian. I'm a Middle East historian. I know something about Middle East. They said, well, have a look at the literature and see if you can do this. So I had a quick look at the work that had been done, the scholarly literature on Soviet Middle East policy. And I found that most of the people who worked on it knew Russian, but knew no Middle Eastern languages, knew nothing about the history, culture, or politics of the Middle East, and were primarily interested in how the Cold War in the Middle East affected either the United States or the Soviet Union. They were either American or, in some cases, Soviet specialists. And I said to myself, well, I'm no more ignorant than these people. Moreover, I have the vast range of translated materials from the Russian, which our government in those days was producing. And so I could read pretty much every open source translated into English, every open Soviet source. And I, in addition, had access to stuff from the Middle East. And this was both the genesis of my interest in the subject. I later on went to teach courses on Soviet and American Middle East policy at the American University in Beirut. But it was also the genesis of my perspective on this issue. Because what I found in almost all the treatments of the Cold War in the Middle East, or Soviet or American policy in the Middle East, was that they primarily were concerned with either the Soviet Union or the United States, or the rivalry between the two of them. They were very little concerned, if they paid any attention to it at all, with the impact of the Cold War on the Middle East itself. And this, living in Beirut in the 70s and the 80s, when I started doing research on these kinds of topics, was something that I noticed was a lacuna. This was a gap. And it was also something that I thought was important. It wasn't just missing from the scholarship, but I felt the Cold War had an enormous impact on the Middle East. I could see that it was having an impact in the 70s and the 80s on the Middle East. So I think this is not only the way I came to this subject, I think it helps to explain the approach that I take in this book. This is not a comprehensive history of the Cold War in the Middle East. It's not really a detailed study of either American or Soviet Middle East policy. I do use documents, mainly stuff that I found through the Cold War History Project, a wonderful online resource that the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars has made available, and the National Security Archive, which George Washington University makes available. And if any of you have any interest in these things, you can read the most hair-raising documents online, at home, in your underwear if you choose. You don't have to go to the National Archives. You don't have to go to a library. You can do it online. That are being newly declassified and put onto either the National Security Archive or the Cold War International History Project. So that's the genesis of the book, and that's the approach that I take on it. The thing that I also realized as I was working on this book was that the Cold War is dead and gone. For my students, it's something that's beyond their ken. For people who are, in their 20s, early 20s, or in their late teens, and now college students, this is something in the past. It's like the Vietnam War or the 100 Years' War. It's, something from the distant past as far as they're concerned. But I realized that, in fact, the patterns developed during the Cold War, especially in this country, but I think also in Russia, and I believe also in some Middle Eastern countries, are still with us. Both patterns of dependence between patrons and clients, and patterns of competition, and I would argue in particular for the United States, a sense in the Middle East that we're engaged in a conflict today with Iran or today with terrorism, which in a certain sense has taken the place of the conflict with communism. I argue in this book that we've gone from being engaged against what President Reagan called an evil empire to being engaged against what President Bush called an axis of evil. And the kind of perhaps exaggerated fear of communism has been replaced by a perhaps exaggerated fear of terrorism as a motive force, as a dynamic element in our foreign policy. Certainly, that's the case in the Middle East. And so this was another motivation for me in writing this book. I felt that if in fact there were patterns derived from the Cold War, and if in fact those patterns had had a negative effect on the Middle East, it might be the case that it would be worthwhile laying them out and exploring the extent to which that is still the case. And I try to do that in this book. What I discovered as I did the research for this book, and it was something that I sort of knew but only really realized as I got deeper and deeper into these documents that I had a chance to look at, was that there were some extraordinary, perhaps coincidental, parallel moves made by the United States and the Soviet Union at the very end of World War II, which were the sort of opening salvos, as it were, of the Cold War in the Middle East. Now, neither of these powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, had been the major actors in the Middle East in the interwar period before World War II. Britain and France dominated the region. If you were going to look for other powers that played a major role, you would say Germany under the Nazis or Italy under the fascists. The Soviet Union had a presence, but it was not a major presence. The United States, almost no presence. It was World War II that brought the superpowers, made them superpowers, and brought them into the Middle East. And it brought them into the Middle East because it alerted them to their vulnerability in terms of two considerations, which continued to be, in my view, the dominating considerations for both superpowers throughout the Cold War. The first was energy, and the second was strategy, the strategic importance of the Middle East. Both were awakened to the vital importance of the Middle East in these two regards by the twin Nazi offensives of 1942, when Rommel was charging across North Africa towards the canal, and had he taken the canal, ultimately the oil fields of the Gulf, and when Nazi panzers were streaking across southern Russia, the southern USSR, trying to reach the oil fields of Baku. The Soviet Union's entire oil production was concentrated in that region, and the Soviets sensed their vulnerability. The Western powers, whose oil production in the region depended very much on oil being produced in Iran, sensed their vulnerability. And this was, I think, the thing that alerted both superpowers to the essential importance of the Middle East in terms of strategy and in terms of energy. And they're twin concerns. And I argue in this book that they continue throughout the Cold War. I found an extraordinary quote from the head of the United States Army Air Force, General Carl Spaatz, who said in June of 1944, the primary strategic objective of the United States Army Air Force is to deny oil to the enemy, to the Nazis. As early as the summer of 1944, in other words, top strategists on the American side had understood the vital importance of oil to modern warfare and understood that this was their primary target. He didn't say a target, the primary target. This is what we're going to go after. As a result, those of you who know anything about the ending of World War II will recall that the Wehrmacht had thousands of armored vehicles which simply could not move because of lack of fuel at the end of the war. And the Luftwaffe had hundreds and hundreds of airplanes, including some of the most advanced airplanes in existence. They had MiG-262 jet fighters, the only jet fighters ever produced at that point, which simply couldn't fly. There was no fuel. They used horses to pull them out on the runways and then put whatever fuel they had into them. So Spaatz was right. Oil was absolutely vital to modern warfare, and from that point on, the importance of the Middle East increases. And another of these sets of coincidences has to do with the fact that at the very end of the war, President Roosevelt, on his way back from Yalta to the United States, takes the time in February of 1945 to stop in Egypt and to spend a whole day meeting with the ruler of a minor Middle Eastern principality, Ibn Saud, the father of the various kings who ruled that kingdom ever since Saudi Arabia. Why does President Roosevelt, who's 7 weeks away from death, he's mortally ill, gravely weak. The description of him by Colonel William Eddy, who was his translator, says that at moments when his attention lagged, you could see the president's ashen pallor. He was exhausted. Why did he stop for a whole day to meet with this minor Middle Eastern ruler? Clearly because everybody in Washington understood at this point both the strategic importance of Saudi Arabia in terms of location and the fact that it was not under the control of a foreign power at that point, but also the fact that Saudi Arabia was the only major country in the Middle East that had an exclusive oil deal with the United States, signed in 1933, and Saudi Arabia was a country which the geologists had already discovered had a huge proportion of the world's proven, what came to be a majority, in fact, of the world's proven reserves. And they already knew the vast oil wealth of Saudi Arabia. So President Roosevelt basically took one day out of the very few remaining days in his life to cement a personal relationship with this ruler, in spite of all the other demands on his time at the end of World War II, because of an understanding of the importance of both the strategic and the energy aspects insofar as Saudi Arabia was concerned. At pretty much the same time, I discovered from the Cold War History Project documents, Stalin was ordering Soviet geologists in the Soviet-occupied northern part of Iran to secretly begin prospecting for oil. Now, the Soviet Union and the United States were the world's two largest oil producers at this time. The United States was the largest, the Soviet Union was the second. Why was Stalin doing this? He was doing this against the will and without the knowledge of the Iranians. The Iranians came to very much resent the Soviet presence in the northern part of Iran. He was doing it because, as I just suggested, the war revealed to the Soviets for the first time the extreme vulnerability of their energy resources. And this and the other strategic factors I talk about in the book come to be continuing themes in this book. Now, I don't want to, they've asked me only to talk for about 20 minutes. I can come back to some of these issues if you're interested in the question and answer. I want to talk about only three other things in the time that remains to me. I want to talk about two aspects of the impact of the Cold War on the Middle East. First, insofar as regional conflict is concerned, and secondly, insofar as democracy in the Middle East is concerned, and the development of governance and government in the Middle East is concerned. And then finally, I'll come back to what I described as the mini Cold War that the United States is engaged in with Iran to conclude. Let me talk first about this impact on regional conflict and impact on the development, the constitutional and democratic development of Middle Eastern countries. There is a view about the Middle East, which goes something like this. This is a region of the world where people have been at one another's throats since time immemorial. These are deeply seated conflicts. These are people who hate each other. These are primordial, aged disputes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get the drift. And the argument here essentially is that these are entirely generated in the Middle East, these conflicts, and that they're very, very old. Well, the major conflicts that I looked at, regional conflicts that I looked at, that took place during the Cold War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Lebanese war that went on from 1975 or a little before that until 1990, and the Iran-Iraq war, are not really very ancient conflicts. They have some roots that go back a bit, but essentially they're modern conflicts. They're essentially results of decolonization, they're results of modern phenomena, and they're not age-old. Moreover, although they have indigenous roots, they started in Lebanon or between the Arabs and Israelis or between Iran and Iraq for reasons that had to do with those countries and peoples' issues with one another. They didn't take place in a vacuum. Each one of these major conflicts became subsumed, one way or another, in the Cold War. They became battlegrounds of the Cold War. They became arenas of the Cold War. And the Cold War didn't only track with them. That is to say, the Soviets didn't end up supporting this party and the United States supporting that party. The Soviet Union and the United States contributed measurably, I found, to the exacerbation, to the worsening of each of these conflicts. They exploited them, they used them, they tried to take advantage of one another via these conflicts, and I discovered they made them, in almost every case, much, much worse. Now, in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you almost can't hear someone in an official or semi-official position in our government, the same, by the way, was true for the Soviets, talk about this conflict without almost wearing their arm out, patting themselves on the back about how many efforts the United States has made in terms of peacemaking. The United States has made enormous efforts to bring peace between Arabs and Israelis. And in fact, there have been a couple of successful efforts in the decades that this conflict has been going on. But one of the things you realize, if you look carefully at the impact of the Cold War on the Arab-Israeli conflict, is that the United States and the Soviet Union ratcheted this conflict up in terms of the level of the wars that were fought between these powers by many multiples. If you look at the 1948 war, the 1956 war, when the Soviet Union and the United States were not using the Arab-Israeli conflict as a sort of a proxy war. In 1948, the Soviets and the Americans both supported the establishment of Israel and essentially opposed the Arab states. In 1956, they were on the same side, but a different side. They both opposed Britain, France, and Israel, and supported Egypt for different reasons in both cases. The point is, they were not the primary arms suppliers to either side in either of these wars, and they were not the principal backer, one on one side and the other on the other side. So this war, or these wars, this earlier phase, as it were, of the Arab-Israeli conflict, was not at that stage polarized along Cold War lines, which is something that came to happen in the 1960s, before, during, and after the 1967 war, which incidentally, Israel fought entirely with French weapons, or almost entirely with French and British weapons. It had some American weapons, but a limited number, and they weren't the high-tech weapons. The nuclear weapons that Israel had and didn't use, it got from France. The aircraft with which it achieved air superiority were Mirage fighters. The tanks that it used were mainly AMX-13s and Centurion tanks. It had a few M48 tanks, but American tanks. But essentially, its arsenal was French. It was only after that that the Arab-Israeli conflict came to track with the Cold War, with the Arab states, or most of them, identified with the Soviet Union, and Israel and some other Arab states identified with the United States. And that led to, and that was the basis for, an enormous increase in the number and sophistication of the weapon systems involved and in the destructiveness of these wars. The war of attrition along the Suez Canal, which most people don't even know happened from 1968 to 1970, was a ferocious, absolutely ferocious phase of the Arab-Israeli wars, fought with not just Soviet weaponry, but Soviet combat personnel in combat capacities. The United States was sending top-of-the-line F-4 Phantom fighters to Israel, even though this was at the height of the Vietnam War, and the production lines in St. Louis for these planes was limited. They were needed in Southeast Asia. They were sent to Israel because Israel, and let me put it differently, the Arab-Israeli conflict was seen as an essential arena of the Cold War. What happened in the late 60s under President Johnson was essentially that the US administration came to be convinced that it was losing a proxy war, or at least was suffering in a proxy war in Southeast Asia, with the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, being seen as a proxy for China and the Soviet Union, and they were looking for a place where they could punish Soviet proxies. And Israel offered them that ally that could do this, that could win a decisive victory over countries that were allied to the Soviet Union. So both the United States and the Soviets were already arming the Arabs, both the United States and the Soviets poured enormous quantities of weapons into this conflict from 1967 onwards. And my argument in this book is that achieving advantage over one another was much more important to both sides than was any other objective insofar as this conflict was concerned, including peacemaking. It's not to say they didn't want to make peace. What they wanted to do was to get advantage over one another. I came upon a document which showed that Secretary of State William Rogers in 1971 had obtained from Anwar Sadat an offer to establish, via American auspices, a bilateral, separate Egyptian-Israeli peace, leaving behind the other Arab countries, which had been the Arab demand up to that point, that all the Arab countries negotiate together and that there be a comprehensive settlement. Sadat said he was willing to abandon this. Rogers goes back to Washington and is told by President Nixon, supported in this by National Security Advisor Kissinger, that no, we don't want this. We want the Russians out of Egypt. Let him get the Russians out of Egypt first, and then we'll talk to him about Middle East peace. Which is not to say they didn't want Middle East peace. They wanted to win the Cold War more. They wanted to get the Soviets out of Egypt. That was their primary objective. A secondary objective might have been Middle East peace, might or might not have been. And this is not, I would argue, an isolated episode. I won't go through the whole litany of cases. I could talk about the Iran-Iraq war. There's some pretty hair-raising stories there. I could talk about the Lebanon war. Let me just leave it by saying that what the Cold War did, I would argue, is to exacerbate these conflicts. These were indigenous conflicts. They had their own roots. But what the superpowers did was to get involved in them and use them to their own advantage. And quite frequently, this increased suffering, increased the level of violence, increased the destructiveness of these wars. Let me talk briefly about the issue of democracy. The Soviet Union, of course, was never a great paragon of democracy in its third world policy. Never claimed to be, or if they claimed to be, it wasn't terribly sincere. The United States, of course, has always argued that it was a beacon of freedom in the world. And in fact, this is true. What the United States has primarily meant by this is free enterprise, freedom for individuals. They haven't really, at least in the Middle East, American policymakers, taken terribly seriously support for democracies. And as I looked case by case, from Iran in 1953 to some of the smaller Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon and Jordan in the 50s, to a few other cases, what I saw was that both superpowers were willing to align themselves with any regime, the devil included pretty much, if that regime would be aligned with them in this rivalry with the Soviet Union. What was important was the Cold War rivalry, not the nature of a regime, not whether it was repressive or democratic or anything else. The Soviets claimed to be supportive of social justice. They aligned themselves with hideous, reactionary, backwards regimes in spite of their proclaimed ideals. The United States proclaimed that it was in favor of freedom. It basically took anybody who would come into the American column if they would align themselves with the United States. And the effect of this, I would argue, in places like Iran, where a parliamentary democratic regime was overthrown by an American-British organized coup in 1953, was to undermine efforts to establish democracy in the Middle East. Now, when I lecture to students about democracy in the Middle East, they're a little skeptical. They say, well, democracy in the Middle East, it's almost an oxymoron. This is a region that is almost a black hole today as far as democracy is concerned. And that's true. It's particularly true of most of the Arab countries. However, it wasn't always the case. And it is not a region that's been devoid of attempts to bring about democracy. In an earlier book, Resurrecting Empire, I tried to talk about attempts in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, in Iran in 1905, to establish constitutional regimes. Before many countries in Southern Europe or Eastern Europe had constitutions, the Ottoman Empire and Iran had constitutions. And there were parliamentary regimes in many of these countries in the 50s and the 60s. They were weak, they had very serious problems, but the Sudan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Iran all had parliamentary governments, as well as Turkey at different times, as well, of course, as Israel, had parliamentary or otherwise democratic governments at different times in the 50s and the 60s. Now, the problems of democracy don't start and end with the Cold War. Problems of democracy in the Middle East have their own history. All I argue in this book is that the Cold War did not help at all, and in many cases it hindered. In the case of Iran, it's very clear that this coup of 1953 took place essentially for Cold War reasons. The United States was afraid of communism. It had an exaggerated fear of communism in all of the cases that I looked at. In fact, communism was not powerful in Jordan or Lebanon either, where American intervention was essentially directed in an undemocratic fashion out of an exaggerated fear of communism. And the last thing I would say is about democracy is that any system, the most well-established democratic system, ours, the British, the French, in time of war tends to be affected by the need to concentrate power in the hands of the executive. That's normal and natural in wartime. Think of President Wilson. Think of Clemenceau. Think of Lloyd George in World War I. These are cases where unheard of powers were concentrated in the hands of the executive. Think of President Roosevelt or Prime Minister Churchill in World War II. In the most important democracies in the modern era, this was the case. Imagine the impact of conflict and war, which I've argued were exacerbated in the Middle East by the Cold War, on weak systems like the Middle Eastern systems. The Middle East is a region that has one of the world's oldest traditions of authoritarian, autocratic government. In fact, before most people had government, the Middle East had authoritarian, autocratic government millennia ago. My daughter is an archaeologist. She's worked in northern Mesopotamia as well as in Yemen, and she's worked on places where 6 millennia ago they had large city-states that were probably pretty autocratic. So it's a region that has its own problems with autocracy. But as I already suggested, it's a region that has had a tradition in the modern era of attempting to establish democracy. And my point here is the Cold War and conflicts that were exacerbated by the Cold War increased this tradition of concentrating power in the hands of the state, in the hands of the autocrat, whether it's the Egyptian president or whether it's the king of Saudi Arabia or whoever it may be. And so my suggestion is that this conflict harmed the possibilities, slim though they may have been in some cases, of a movement towards democracy. Let me conclude by talking about what I've called the new Cold War between the United States and Iran. Fortunately, to some extent, this was the global war on terror, and the exaggerated focus on Iran as part of the axis of evil were features of the foreign policy of the previous administration. It gives me great pleasure to use those words, the previous administration. However, they're deeply ingrained in the thinking of American elites. The idea that terrorism is something that has to be dealt with via war, the idea rather than other means, covert means, intelligence, whatever it may be. And secondly, the idea that there are irreconcilable that there are irreconcilable differences between the United States and Iran. And finally, that Iran poses an enormous threat, that Iran is an enormously powerful country that poses an enormous threat. One of the striking things that comes out from examining the Cold War is that the United States waged the Cold War against an enormously powerful rival, the Soviet Union, which had major alliances with regional forces in the Middle East, with very few bases and a very small number of troops actually in the Middle East. For most of the Cold War, the United States had a very small military footprint. We now have the largest deployment of American forces outside our border in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia theater. To fight or to confront the Soviet Union, almost no military presence. To confront an amorphous threat involving primarily terrorists who are in underground networks, we have this vast military deployment. And I argue here in this book that this global war on terror, this idea that we're engaged in a mini Cold War with Iran, in fact justifies this, but confuses people. This, I think, is a big mistake. I think we have to carefully examine how we got to this point, why we are engaged in all of these adventures, because we've been gotten into some very serious ones. Now, the president has said he's going to get the United States out of Iraq. I hope he's successful. We still have a major war in Afghanistan, not clear how we're going to end that, and we have a huge military presence. I haven't heard anybody talk about how that is going to be drawn down. Moreover, we still have an enormously, potentially dangerous confrontation with Iran, which may or may not lead to war, either between the United States and Iran or between Israel and Iran. I suggest in this book that we have to re-examine all of these issues if we're to avoid the kinds of pitfalls that we got into during the Cold War, and if we're to avoid the pitfalls that I suggest this mini Cold War with Iran may get us into. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for a very concise and very compelling presentation, and I very much enjoyed reading the book, which fleshes out with, as I say, some original material, these arguments very well. I'm not a political scientist, so forgive me if you know, I'm an anthropologist by training, and so that if the questions seem a bit naive, but you present an argument about the Cold War, which is a widely accepted story as essentially a polar conflict between the U.S. and its allies in the world, and particularly the Middle East, and the Soviets and theirs. And your argument is that their rivalry from 1945 to 1989 had a significant and, in the end, also a deleterious impact on the politics of the region. Mm-hmm. Ergo, sowing crisis and conflict. Now, I would not necessarily dispute that view, except to wonder whether it is nuanced enough. And I'm thinking, for one thing, of China. Mm-hmm. Now, China and India, an architect of the so-called non-aligned nations that was also an artifact of the Cold War, China do not figure, these two countries do not figure prominently in your book until the end of the story, with the rise of their economies, with the fact that U.S. power in the region is actually diminished because of great antipathy towards the United States, and India in particularly moves into this power vacuum, and China does as well. Now, I spent part of the Cold War from 1979 to 1981 in Yemen, and as you discuss in the book, it was one of these victims of this Cold War rivalry because there was North Yemen and South Yemen. North Yemen was bolstered by Saudi Arabia, which was a client state of the United States, and South Yemen was a client state of the Soviet Union. But China had actually a pivotal role to play in the reconstruction of the country. And to this day, the only Cold War memorial that I know in Yemen is one honoring the Chinese workers who died building the highway that connects the capital Sana'a with a Red Sea city of Al-Hodeidah. So this leads me to wonder whether Yemen was exceptional insofar as Chinese participation in the affairs of the country are concerned, or whether a story of the stark polarities between the US and the Soviet Union may not be enough to capture the nuances of the Cold War and their impact on the region. And this leads me to a related question, because I'm going to try to anticipate what your answer is going to be. You seem to be concerned with politics in the sense of what is sometimes called, in your discipline, hard power. I'm not sure I like this term, but that's, so for example, arms that people can call to use in the exercise of force, the monopolization of scarce resources, the ability to intervene in national politics, including orchestrating coups, which you talk about at length in your book. And in that sense, China arguably could not have played a major role in the Middle East. So in a way, this attention to hard power suggests that there were certain actors who could play this, but other actors could not. But if you look at the question in terms of soft power, in the form, for example, of development aid, in which both the United States and the Soviet Union played a hand, and certainly in terms of the spread of popular culture by the United States in the region at this time as well, the story, it seems to me, would become more complicated, but I'm wondering whether, in fact, the argument would at all change. So those are my two questions, and then perhaps we could open it up to the floor.
Okay, those are good questions. Thank you, Steve. I think that my perspective on China might have been determined by my point of view, the place that I started thinking about this, which was Beirut, which, unlike Yemen, you're absolutely right about Yemen, which, unlike Yemen, was not a place where the Chinese had made enormous inroads. You're absolutely right about Yemen, where they had a role that was quite important, that major road building effort that they made and other things that they did. In Beirut, they had a huge embassy, and they had a presence, but neither in terms of hard power, though they did ship weapons to various Middle Eastern countries, nor in terms of soft power did they have the kind of impact that either the United States or the Soviet Union had. Mao Zedong enjoyed a brief period of popularity in the Arab world. His works were translated into Arabic. All kinds of stuff was translated from Chinese into Arabic, as were things from Russian and obviously things from English. But I think that in that competition in most parts of the Middle East, whether Turkey and Iran or Israel and the Arab countries around it, and most of the countries in North Africa, I don't think China had the same kind of weight in either soft or hard power that did the Soviet Union. I think it had more impact in the Horn of Africa, Yemen, other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where it was very much more successful, I think, in a variety of ways, partly because many of them were really searching for a sort of a third way, where they wouldn't have to go with the United States or the Soviet Union. And maybe that had to do with the fact that the places that I concentrated on, Lebanon, ArabIsraeli, Iran, Iraq, were zones of conflict, where they were seeking both elements of hard power, as you put it, and diplomatic support, and that the Soviet Union and its allies, or the United States, even more so, were able to give. Now, you're absolutely right in your second point. I really don't give enough attention, I think, in this book. I probably don't give enough attention to what you've called what you've mentioned, what you've described as soft power, and what you mean there is the competition on other levels between the United States, the Soviet Union, and other countries. And this is a realm where if I had dealt with it, it would have been another chapter. My editor would have torn her hair if I'd written another chapter, but it might have been a good chapter to write. If I had written another chapter in which I examined this, I would have come up with something like the following. The Soviet Union was able to make a serious run in terms of arguing that it was able to offer development aid, that it had a model to be followed, that it had ideas and culture that were attractive only for the first part of the Cold War. As time went on, it became pretty clear that Middle Eastern elites understood that the United States had more to offer in terms of economic aid, because the United States was infinitely richer, but also that Western cultural values were either more attractive or were already imprinted and implanted in many parts of Middle Eastern elites. And I think this is one of many reasons that the Soviet Union does somewhat worse towards the end of the Cold War. It's elements of soft power. It's not just, American vetoes at the Security Council. It's not just that the American warplanes are superior to Soviet warplanes. It's also that the United States has more money, and the United States is seen in various ways as more attractive culturally. I think that's still true, incidentally. The former president, I think very much, and his colleagues and allies, I think completely misunderstood the idea that they hate, of how people regard the United States and the Middle East when he said they hate our freedom. Actually, they like our freedom. American ideals, American culture, the American free enterprise are generally very much admired in most parts of the Middle East, are and have been. America as a country that was not an imperialist power, unlike European countries, unlike Tsarist Russia or Soviet Russia, unlike imperialist Britain or imperialist France, was enormously to our advantage at the beginning of the American engagement in the Middle East. So I wish I had actually maybe written a chapter which engaged with these issues of soft power, because I think it would have fleshed out the picture that I give here. Thanks.
You're listening to Rashid Khalidi discussing Sowing Crisis, the Cold War in the Middle East. So it's now time to take some questions from the audience. Please come forward and line up at the microphone, and please limit yourself to one tersely phrased question, so that, and please do come to a question that the speaker can answer. And I ask you to keep it brief so that everyone in the room who would like to ask a question has the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Yes, you spoke of the Cold War's radicalization of the indigenous conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't it also work in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict the other way around? Case in point is the sale of phantoms that you mentioned. Those took place in the last year of the Johnson administration.
Mm-hmm.
In January, Premier Eshkol of Israel paid a visit to the United States, January of '68. At that point, Johnson he ordered the production of components with long lead times, which was a precursor to actually placing the orders. In October, the decision was made for the sale, and because of his authorization of the production in January, the planes could then be delivered by the end of 1969.
Right.
This was entirely an expression of domestic political forces. Both the Pentagon and the State Department opposed the sale. It went through for domestic political reasons, I believe. The phantoms were duly delivered in late 1969, and Israel immediately used them in the War of Attrition,
Right.
which led, of course, to the extraordinary invasion, the aid by the Soviets that you mentioned.
Right.
They assumed the air defense of Egypt. That's the picture. I mean, the '73 war is another case.
So what's the question?
The question is, as I said at the outset, didn't Israel in particular, the Arab-Israeli conflict in general, itself radicalize the Cold War? I mean, it led to the 1973 war, which was a nuclear confrontation.
I see what you're saying. Well, some historians have actually said that this, what I've described as an escalation and exacerbation of the Arab-Israeli conflict due to its engagement with the Cold War, some historians have actually said that this led to what I think it's Dalek, or it could be Walter Isaacson, described as the worst crisis of the Nixon presidency, which is the nuclear standoff at the end of the '73 war. I think that it may be that the Arab-Israeli conflict ended up making the Cold War worse. But I don't think that contradicts my argument that the Cold War made the Arab-Israeli conflict worse. I mean, the involvement of the Soviets leads the United States to do things that I don't think it would otherwise have done. The fact that the Soviets are sending air defense crews and pilots to fly in combat in Egypt in 1969 and '70 increases enormously the concern of the United States and leads the United States to act in ways that I don't think it otherwise would have. That in turn leads the Soviets to do things. And by the end of the '73 war, you have Kissinger and Brezhnev playing nuclear brinkmanship with the Secretary of State, according to this remarkable memo that is now declassified, telling the Soviets one thing: yes, we'll restrain the Israelis at the end of the '73 war, and then going to Israel and telling the Israeli leadership, well, you know, if something happens while I'm on the plane, nobody's going to say anything. In other words, go ahead and break the ceasefire. And that in turn leads the Soviets to put nuclear weapons underway for Egypt, which in turn leads the United States to go to DEFCON 3. So yeah, I think you're actually right. I think that the Arab-Israeli conflict ended up making the Cold War in some ways more dangerous.
In ways that other regional conflicts could not have.
You're probably right.
In terms of client states and proxy wars and the idea that, as our former president stated, that you're either with us or against us,
right.
I was a bit startled not to find any detailed mention. I mean, you do a wonderful job of explaining the derailment of democracy in Iran and Mossadegh's planned coup. But Pakistan, which is where I'm originally from, I think is a country that got hopelessly caught in a non-ideological opposing and fighting with Russia for the Afghani occupation. And to this day, I think that was perhaps the biggest mistake of our foreign policy, because we have ideologically nothing against communism as such. China is one of our best friends. But the idea that this war was fought using Pakistan as proxy, leading to over 1 million refugees from Afghanistan coming to Pakistan, the slow Talibanization of mainstream Islam in the country, and recently the loss of Benazir Bhutto, as well as the complete military insurgency in the country. Do you think that it may not feature as a Middle Eastern country, but that Pakistan has indeed paid a very high price for association in this war?
Yeah, no, the short answer to your question is yes. And the reason that I don't really bring Pakistan in is, as you suggest, it's not generally thought of as a Middle Eastern country. But to be fair, I do talk about Afghanistan a little bit, and it's also not thought of as a Middle Eastern country. And I think that Afghanistan and Pakistan are both cases of what I call the toxic debris of the Cold War still being with us. Al-Qaeda and Taliban are leftovers of the Cold War. We sort of lobotomize ourselves, and we forget the history behind where these people come from. Al-Qaeda is not a term that somebody made up. Al-Qaeda comes from Qaeda Ma'lumatiyya, which means database in Arabic, and it's the database that bin Laden put all of the folks that our intelligence service, the Saudi intelligence service, the Pakistani ISI, the Israeli, Algerian, and Egyptian intelligence service kindly shipped to Afghanistan to fight the Cold War for us and support the Mujahideen against the Red Army, which was then in occupation of Afghanistan. You're absolutely right. The same thing happens with Pakistan. American policy towards Pakistan is entirely instrumental and is entirely a focus of this blind obsession with fighting the Cold War. There's a wonderful quote that I have from Brzezinski in the book, which I think we gave to a French newspaper or magazine, Nouvel Observateur, where he says something like, he's asked, well, don't you realize that fighting this Afghan war has created, this is before 9/11, of course, has created these Islamic fanatics who are terribly dangerous. And he says something like, but I mean, we defeated communism. What does it matter if we created a few troublemakers someplace? To be fair, this was before 9/11 that he said this. But we are still dealing with, the bastard children of the Cold War, if you want, in the people who attacked the United States in 2001 or blew up Mumbai, Madrid, London, and so forth, are in a distant fashion traceable back to this Cold War obsession with any weapon to fight the Soviet menace. And in particular, I ask anybody who talks about Islamic radicalism, or heaven forbid, Islamofascism, to do a little study of how the United States used Islam during the Cold War, how the United States used Islamic movements during the Cold War, how the United States used some of the same people who are today our sworn enemies during the Cold War, the same organizations. It's not just Taliban, it's not just Al-Qaeda. It's much broader than that. And I suggest that the patterns, some of the patterns that developed during the Cold War, unfortunately, are still with us. I'm afraid they're also still with the Russians, and they're also probably still with some Middle Eastern countries, too.
You opened by stating that the United States and the Soviet Union had parallel policies regarding the Middle East, and were both responsible for both sowing conflict and ratcheting up conflict. So I wonder, does Russia currently enjoy some of the Islamic backlash that we seem to get, that the United States seems to get from the region?
Yeah.
And if not, is it simply because the United States was the victor and so therefore seen as the larger enemy, but having equal policies at the outset, they're both responsible.
Right.
So is there no reason to hold them responsible for it afterwards?
The interesting thing is that during most of the Cold War, most Islamic radical movements and many Islamists were virulently anti-communist, but not very anti-American. So the Muslim Brotherhood or the Wahhabi regime in Saudi Arabia, by and large were, if not friendly to the United States, in some cases working with the United States, at least not hostile to it. And they were virulently, as I say, anti-communist. The Iranian Revolution, which goes out of a different tradition than Sunni Islam, marks a change. The Iranian revolutionaries were both anti-communist and anti-Western, anti-Soviet and anti-American. And that marks a new trend, or the beginning of a new trend. And we see this again with bin Laden in Afghanistan, and with many of the people who helped to defeat the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and who, having beaten, as they see it, not just the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but destroyed the Soviet Union, then said, well, now we can turn to the other great giant. So you have this peculiar process. The last thing I would say is that if you look carefully at the war in Chechnya, I think you'll see that the Russians, Freudian slip, you'll see that the Russians have their own problems with radical Islam. It's not just the West.
Hi. This long story about Cold War and the new Cold War, I like this term, which from time to time there were armed conflicts. The rulers and democratic systems of the countries in the Middle East, the new history that you use this term Islamofascist, then when the fight was with the German fascists and the fight with Japan, the Americans signed capitulation papers with these countries.
Yeah.
These countries totally surrendered to the American troops. And as a result, as we see now, both Germany and Japan live better than Americans do. So would you see that in future, or it's a lost opportunity, that countries in the Middle East could surrender to the American troops and live in a united world like Germany and Japan live with spectacular results?
Germany and Japan are two of the most advanced industrial countries in the world, were and are. They're two countries which, in spite of authoritarian periods in their modern history, have also got a democratic tradition. They had a democratic tradition before World War II. And they were two enormously rich countries before the war. Their human capital was not affected by the destruction of their physical capital. So the accountants were there, the factory workers were there, the managers were there, the people who understood how to do finance were there. It simply required rebuilding the Marshall Plan and the Korean War and the Cold War for them to spring up. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and Germany declared war on the United States after having launched World War II by attacking various countries, Poland, Russia, and so on and so forth. there's no parallel. The Middle East didn't attack the United States. Why should the Middle East surrender to the United States? Iraq didn't attack the United States. You could argue that Al-Qaeda attacked the United States from bases in Afghanistan, but that's Al-Qaeda. It wasn't the Taliban who attacked us. They gave support and bases and succor to people who attacked us, for which one presumes there should be a penalty. But the Taliban didn't come and fly into our buildings. It was Al-Qaeda who did so. Whereas the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Germany launched World War II. So I just don't see the parallels at all, frankly. I'm sorry.
In your view, obviously, the Cold War patterns, prevent that are still persuasive today, prevent effective U.S. engagement with the region. But would you say that's the dominant reason that the U.S. is unable to effectively engage with the Middle East, or are there other forces? And if so,
Yeah.
what would they be?
There are many reasons why the United States is not, I think, able to effectively engage with the Middle East. The first, I would argue, is this reductionist stereotyping, which goes back to the Cold War. Seeing, for example, a whole range of movements as in exactly the same category as the Bush administration did was rather like, during the Cold War, seeing any country or force or power or party that was aligned with the Soviet Union as in absolutely the same category. This is reductionist. It involves a great deal of simplification. It means you don't really understand what's going on, and it means that there's no nuance. There's no sense, in fact, often to your policymaking. And if you go step by step, looking at American policymaking in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth in the Middle East, this oversimplification and this reductionism, I don't think served the United States terribly well. It certainly didn't serve the people of the region very well. And I would argue it continues. I mean, we lump Al-Qaeda and Iran together. We lump Hamas and Hezbollah together, one Sunni, one Shia, one created for specific reasons in Lebanon by a certain kind of Israeli occupation, the other created in response to other conditions in another country. And the term terrorism, of course, always is invoked here. I think it flattens distinctions, this kind of oversimplification, and it leads to terrible policymaking as a result. It leads in many cases to people really getting very angry because they understand and you don't understand. Now, you say, are there other problems with American policymaking in the Middle East? Of course there are. There are many other problems. Americans, as a rule, don't know that much about the world. Now, obviously, this audience is different. You're here to listen to a talk about the Cold War, so I'm not talking about anybody here or the people who may be listening or watching. But by and large, we're a country which, because of our history, because of our fortunate history, has never had to fear attack from abroad since the Revolutionary War, at least, or very soon afterwards. And except for the Cold War, never had any existential dangers. The Cold War and the fact that the Soviet Union could annihilate the United States, or had the potential to do so, was the first time that the United States was existentially threatened. Most other countries in the world have to fear their neighbors at some time in their history, including their recent history, and have deep, profound existential fears. France, Germany, Russia, think of any country. It suffered bombardment, invasion, occupation, attack, fear of attack. Not the United States. So because we are a continent, because we have smaller, weaker, much weaker countries as our only neighbors within thousands of miles, because we've never had this kind of danger, because of other things in the way American history is developed. Americans don't know languages, don't travel, don't know much about the world, and don't care very much. This is a problem in making foreign policy. It means that the foreign policy elite coming out of places like Harvard and Columbia and Princeton and so on and so forth is free to mess things up, and nobody's able to restrain them. It means that an insular culture can develop. Thank you. It means that an insular culture can develop around the Beltway, where people who failed in the previous administration just have to wait until their party gets back into power and they have a chance to fail again. And we're seeing this with some of the Democratic foreign policy elite being brought in after, in my view, not doing terribly well during the Clinton administration. And I'm sure we're going to see it in the next Republican administration when the various paragons who made a mess of the world in the Bush administration will come, their turn on the merry-go-round will come again. An informed, angry citizenry, the kind of thing that we're currently hearing about AIG bonuses, would benefit us enormously where foreign policy is concerned. If somebody would hold to account, for example, the people who brought us since 1991, 18 years and counting of peace process without peace. Think about that for a minute. If somebody would hold them to account and say, you messed up, you did a terrible job. That's not entirely the United States' fault, but let somebody else, let a different approach get in there. I think perhaps we would benefit. And that's just one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about.
My name is Michael Brower, and I want to ask you a question about Afghanistan. Speaking of foreign policy elites messing things up, I hesitated to do so because it is not, of course, part of the Middle East normally, and yet you yourself have mentioned it several times, as have other questioners, and it is one of the two hot issues going on today.
So go ahead.
I'm terribly concerned about President Obama sending troops to Afghanistan. I challenged the Afghan ambassador who was here at the Harvard Kennedy School a few days ago, saying, he says, more troops are wonderful. I said, wouldn't it be better if we sent physicians and nurses and veterinarians and experts in creating some export other than opium? He said, oh no, we need the troops. I would like your comment on Obama's foreign policy towards Afghanistan, which I think is a disaster.
Yeah. My hope during the campaign, when then Senator Obama, candidate Obama, talked about withdrawing from Iraq and sending more troops to Afghanistan, was that he said that for reasons of politics, which is to say that he thought he couldn't say, I'm going to leave here and there and cut and run, and that would make him a target of typical Republican tactics insofar as security issues are concerned. It turns out that was not an accurate assessment. It turns out that as far as Iraq was concerned, he was committed within limits to a policy of withdrawal, but that where Afghanistan is concerned, insofar as his administration has yet developed a policy, it seems to be a policy of continuity with the policy of the Bush administration. I find that troubling for several reasons. This is not a country which, in its modern history, or in its history, has had a centralized, effective government. This is a country that has barely had government for most of its modern history. It's not a country that is easy to govern. It's not a country that has ever responded well to external powers. Alexander the Great, the British Empire, the Tsars, the Soviets, I think, found that out sooner or later. Alexander's successors. He didn't live long enough to see it, but his successors did. And as Ambassador Charles Freeman, who recently was forced to withdraw his nomination as director of the National Intelligence Council, said, the United States went to Afghanistan originally to punish the perpetrators of the attacks on the United States, to deal with them, and to deal with their local enablers, Taliban, Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And somehow that mission morphed into nation building in a country that, as I just said, never had a modern central government. How did that happen? And what do we think we're doing? And I would just echo what Ambassador Freeman said. I do think that those groups, and they now have metastasized into groups, that both attack the United States and have attacked other countries from bases in the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region, are a serious danger, and that the United States has every business trying to deal with that danger. I seriously question whether the approach taken, which involves rebuilding Afghanistan, turning it into some kind of state, modern state, A, can work, and B, has anything to do with that original mission. I don't think that it does, frankly, and I'm not sure that it's a wise thing to be undertaking. And I have no idea about troop levels. I'm not a military man. I don't know anything about these issues. But I basically don't think that the United States would be well advised to continue to try and create in Afghanistan structures that have never existed there. The Soviets tried to do the same thing. The Soviet invasion was not just the Red Army behaving nastily in yet another place. It was that, but it was also the Soviets trying to bring women's education and adult literacy and running water and so on and so forth to places that didn't have those things. Now, I'm all in favor of running water and women's literacy and adult education. I really am, and I wish the Afghans had those things. But if the Afghans have those things, they're going to have them because the Afghans decided to have those things. They're not going to have them because the Red Army shoves them down their throats. And unfortunately, they're not going to have them because NATO and the United States shoves them down their throats. And in fact, the backlash against those things is part of the problem. Taliban is, in a certain sense, not just created by CIA, ISI, Saudi intelligence. In a certain sense, it's created as a backlash to forced modernization by the Red Army. And we're engaged in something of the same thing. I'm not saying that people who engage in that backlash are good people. They're bad people. But I think we have to look at that thing holistically and see how we get a hideous phenomenon like Taliban, blowing up people and attacking women and so on and so forth. And I don't know that more and more and more troops is the answer. I would like to hear military people speak uninhibitedly about how many troops they think it would take to pacify Afghanistan. If General Shinseki said several 100,000 troops to pacify Iraq, a much smaller country and a flat country, and a country that air power works very nicely in, to the terrible effect on civilians, of course, but works very nicely. Compared to Afghanistan, it's a piece of cake. And we've lost 4,260-odd American service people in Iraq. I'm very skeptical about that approach to Afghanistan.
I go for about 1 million troops over 40 years.
Yes, my name's Daniel Perry. I have a request, just if you could comment on maybe the tipping point for the backlash from Al-Qaeda to the U.S.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Okay, excuse me. When the U.S. engaged bin Laden and components of Al-Qaeda during the Cold War, there was a point when they changed forces and kind of, just as you indicated, changed focus on who they wanted to
turned
fight
against the United States.
instead of the Soviets.
Right.
What could we have done to prevent that, and can you explain what we did that caused it?
Okay, I mean, to some extent, I'd have to recapitulate the argument of a large part of the book, but I'll try and do it briefly right here. During the Cold War, one of the weapons that the United States chose to use to oppose not just the Soviet Union and not just communist parties in the Middle East and in the region, but also radical movements, socialist movements, left-wing movements, was radical Islam, or Islamic movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere, like Wahhabi Islam. And the high point of this came during the Reagan administration, when the United States decided to not just send the most extreme radical Islamists from within Afghanistan, support the most extreme radical Islamist factions within the resistance to the Soviets, within the Mujahideen movement, but also to bring in the most extreme and radical types from elsewhere. I think you have to look at that as the beginning of the problem. And so when I say patterns left over from the Cold War, this kind of cynical exploitation of any tool to achieve a short-term end, I think is part of the problem. I think it should have been clear that there were ways in which such people had values that we shouldn't have been associated with, and that defeating the Red Army in Afghanistan may or may not have been an absolutely valid objective, but the means used should have been examined much more closely, and that was the beginning of this problem. Is that clear?
Yeah, so you're saying we didn't necessarily create them, we sought them out.
Precisely.
Okay,
Precisely.
that makes sense. Thank you.
Hi, one brief comment and one question. The brief comment is that the Iranian, I think you mentioned that the Iranian revolutionaries were both against the USSR and the United States. I would like to point out that there were actually different phases of the revolution. During the earlier phase, the revolution was primarily anti-US imperialism. And during the second stage, where the secularists, nationalists, and socialists of a variety of kinds lost power to the Islamists, then we had the rhetoric of neither Russia nor the U.S.
Point taken.
I would point out to different phases of the revolution. The second question.
Go ahead, sorry.
And here is the question that I have, and of course you are the expert on the subject. I wonder whether you make any distinction between private and public foreign policies between nations, in particular Iran and the United States. Publicly, we have been expecting irreconcilable differences leading to the game of chicken and egg and eventually war, and we thought this is what was going to happen during the Bush administration, and in fact, prominent Iranian scholars such as Erwan Abrahamian told us that, that the war against Iran was imminent. However, if we look at very closely between backdoor agreements or private agreements, if you will,
with Iran,
we'll see there has been a large number of agreements between the two countries. For example, regarding Afghanistan, regarding Iraq. Iran was tremendously happy to get rid of Saddam Hussein. I may be wrong, but my assumption is that the U.S. would not have attacked Iraq without Iran's consensus. So I wonder whether you can make this distinction between private and public presentation.
I'm not sure I would make it in that way, but I take your point that at the same time that you had this ferocious rhetoric against the Iranian regime in the last administration, you did have various areas of practical cooperation. But again, think of the phases. In Iraq, this came several years into the occupation, when the United States was in deep trouble. And it finally realized that it might behoove the United States to take advantage of neutralizing Iranian-supported factions among the Shia in the South in particular, and that by so doing, it could defuse the problems it was facing. And so then you had the Bush administration allowing Ambassador Crocker to talk to Iran. But that was late, well into the global war on terror, well into this mini Cold War with Iran. I think there's also something to what you suggest in that the administration has talked a really ferocious a game against Iran, and yet we haven't waged war against them, real war. But we are waging a covert war against them. We're waging a proxy war against them. We see factions and groups aligned with Iran as if they are Iran. I mean, the way American policymakers talk about Hezbollah, it's as if they're Iranian soldiers in Lebanon, or Hamas, as if the Iranians themselves are in Gaza. We are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, according to newspaper reports, on covert operations either directed against Iranian nuclear installations or in support of separatist groups in Baluchistan and Iranian Kurdistan. I don't know. We don't know. The newspapers don't tell us the details. But that Congress has appropriated the money and that somebody's doing something, we do know. So there is a war for influence. There's a proxy war. There's a covert war. And I would argue there was, at least under the previous administration, an ideological war going on. I mean, you could go, as I did in November and December, from Beirut to Cairo and read almost exactly the same editorials in the newspapers about the danger of the creation of an Islamic emirate in Gaza and how this linked to Iran means and da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, it could be that the Lebanese and Egyptian elites that are channeling, Washington's ideas have these ideas as well. But I have a feeling this is part of an ideological Cold War that was going on at that stage as part of the lead up to the Gaza war. This was before the war in Gaza actually erupted. So I don't think you should underestimate, even though there are these areas of some degree of understanding. Afghanistan is another case, you're right. I don't think you should underestimate the degree to which there is a Cold War also going on. Remember, the United States and the Soviet Union had a hotline and had all kinds of side agreements during détente at the same time as some very, very ferocious phases of the rivalry were still ongoing. Yeah.
All right, two last questions, and then we'll have to conclude.
Aren't you yourself committing an act of deception here, because you are speaking to people who you know in this area of the country are very liberal, left-oriented people in general? I don't think that you are, when you use the term a mini Cold War in relation to Iran, that's a tremendous distortion of the danger that they constitute to the whole world. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I have the impression that you're trying to deceive people. You claim that Americans are so ignorant and all that, but a lot of us aren't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think
I think you, in fact, are trying to cultivate a certain kind of ignorance among American liberals and leftists about the actual reality and danger of Islam in the world today.
Okay, can I speak to that? I think you're wrong, obviously. I argue very forcefully in this book that there has been a demonization and an inflation of Iran, the Iranian threat to the world and to the United States, just as I argue that there was an inflation of the Soviet threat. That's not to say that there wasn't a Soviet threat, and that's not to say that there aren't differences of interests between the United States and Iran, or that everything is hunky-dory. I simply say, I am simply arguing that you have got a body of conventional opinion, whatever liberals or leftists or whoever you think composes this audience may think. There's a body of conventional opinion in this country which believes a great deal, I think, about the power and danger of Iran, which I think is exaggerated or false. For one thing, about the Iranian nuclear potential. I am very much against the idea of Iran having nuclear weapons. I would like to see the entire Middle East be a nuclear-free zone. I would like to see serious nuclear non-proliferation in the Middle East by all Middle Eastern powers, stretching over to Pakistan, but also including Israel. I would like to see the major nuclear powers build down their nuclear arsenal as a means of showing their good faith and encouraging this kind of thing to happen. But having said that, I think that the way in which Iran is hyped and super hyped and super hyped in some quarters in some quarters in this country is irresponsible and is deceptive. And as far as the danger of Islam is concerned, I don't think Islam poses a danger. I think there are Islamic terrorists who have been dangerous and are dangerous. But this is a specific problem. It does not involve the billion and odd Muslims. It does not involve the dozens of countries that are Muslim majority countries. It is something that we have to deal with. I think that the way in which it was dealt with in the previous administration accentuated, I don't want to say accentuated, multiplied the danger of that problem. I don't think that you demonize people and you hyperinflate a threat. I suggest you read the book, and then you'll see, you know, whether I'm deceiving people or not.
Thank you. Next questioner. This is the last question.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk. I have two very quick questions. The first one regards where do you see the relationship between Iraq and Iran, especially in light of their religious differences, and also with regards to their energy interests and energy policies. My second very quick question, you clearly stated at the end of your presentation that you favored a scaling down of U.S. military presence in the Middle East.
Right.
What would you replace it with? How reliable would that suggestion be? And also, where do you see the American business community, especially in the energy sector,
That's
in
three
the area?
questions so
Sorry.
far. You said one.
I'll take
I'll
your answers.
I'll answer two. I think the American military presence in the Middle East antagonizes people and exacerbates our problems. I don't think there are security interests of the United States that are very well served by a huge, massive military footprint in the region. There may be specific problems that have to be dealt with by military means, but I think the United States managed to wage, and I would add win, the Cold War with an over-the-horizon military presence. I don't see an enemy in the Middle East, state or non-state, that requires this kind of presence. There are no enemies of American national interests there that require this, in my view. That's the answer to your second question. As far as your first question is concerned, well, Iran and Iraq don't have such enormous religious differences, given that the largest single group in Iraq, probably a majority, are Shia, and given that the very large majority of Iranians are Shia. So there are religious differences. There are more Shia proportionately in Iran than there are in Iraq, but that's not the problem. The problem is the different forms of government. Iran has this specific form of theocracy, which I think most Iraqis do not want. I think that the provincial elections showed that. And moreover, most Iraqis are nationalists. They're Iraqi nationalists. They don't want to be dominated by Tehran any more than they want to be dominated by Washington, any more than they wanted to be dominated by London. I mean, anybody who knew any Iraqi history would have told the people in Washington in 2003, that this is a country that had spent a very long time getting foreign bases out of its country and a very long time trying to get control of its oil resources, and it was not going to welcome new bases or new attempts to establish a privileged position in Iraqi oil. That's Iraqi nationalism. And that is, I think, the best guarantor of Iraqi independence vis-a-vis Tehran. And I think we're going to see more further development of that kind of sense of independence vis-a-vis Iran on the part of most, I think, Iraqi political formations among Sunnis, Shia, and the growing number of secular parties in Iraq.
Thank you, Rashid Khalidi.
Thanks, Steve.